the ocean shimmers beneath a rising curtain of gold, each wave rolling in with the slow, deliberate breath of a world older than memory. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a deep hum echoes, part wind, part water, part ancient heartbeat. Through the soft light of dawn, a double-hulled canoe emerges, its silhouette steady, cutting across the sea as if guided by something greater than wind or chance. This is the story of a people who refuse to fear the unknown, of navigators who read stars as if they were instructions written for them alone, of families who carried gardens, traditions, and hopes across the largest ocean on Earth, of courage shaped not by battles, but by trust in the sea, the sky, and the wisdom of ancestors. Imagine you are standing on that canoe, the salt brushing your lips, the swell rising beneath your feet, the sky opening above you like a map waiting to be read. What would you notice first? Share your answer in the comments and tell us where you're listening from and whether it's morning, evening, or night for you. And if you're ready to drift deeper into this world, gently tap like and subscribe so more stories can find their way to you. Now dim your screen, let the night close in, and step with me into the story. In the hush before dawn, the first Polynesian voyagers studied the horizon. The sky stretched wide over them, painted in soft gradients of deep indigo and warming grey, as if the day itself were pausing before taking its first breath. The sea lay calm, its surface touched by faint strokes of moonlight, and the distant murmur of waves against the outer reef created a slow and steady rhythm, one that matched the heartbeat of the people who lived upon these scattered tropical shores. In these early centuries, long before the iconic double-hulled canoes took shape across the Pacific, the ancestors of the Polynesians moved gently across islands near Southeast Asia. They lived close to the water's edge, where mangroves grew in tangled thickets, and where the scent of wet earth mixed with the morning's first breeze. Their villages stood on raised wooden platforms sheltered by woven palm thatch, and each home opened directly toward the sea, as though everyone expected the next important message to arrive upon the tide. At this time, no one yet thought of themselves as navigators. They were simply people of the ocean, fisherfolk, gardeners, shell gatherers, living in harmony with a world that shifted between land and lagoon. But the seeds of something extraordinary had already been planted. Beneath the movements of daily life, there was a quiet attentiveness, a way of reading wind patterns, a habit of watching how the moon changed the tides, a curiosity about the paths followed by schools of fish or flocks of seabirds at certain times of year. Children were raised within this culture of observation. Before they learned to speak in full sentences, they were carried down to the shoreline at dusk, allowed to feel the cool water curl around their ankles, and taught to notice the difference between waves created by the wind and those created by unseen landforms beyond the horizon. Some waves came sharp and quick, others rolled heavy and slow. Each carried a message, and even though the small ones might not have understood the meaning, they could feel the patterns begin to settle inside them like familiar songs. At night, when the air cooled and the cicadas quieted, the elders would gather the young around the embers of the cooking fire. They spoke not in grand tales of voyaging, those would come later, but in smaller stories, stories about the stars that blinked into existence above them. they described how each bright point had its season, how some rose in the cold months and others in the warm, and how the position of certain constellations could help predict the coming of storms. These first teachings were practical, yet held a faint shimmer of the mystical. For to these early families, the sky was both map and memory. As generations passed, people travelled between nearby islands with increasing frequency. The canoes they used at first were simple, single-hulled, carved from heavy logs, with small outriggers lashed securely on one side to provide balance in choppy water. The paddlers often stayed within sight of the coast, moving from one familiar shoreline to the next. Yet even in these modest journeys, a quiet transformation was taking place. Each crossing demanded attention to the changing colour of the sea, to the flavour of the wind on the tongue, to the flight pattern of terns and noddies circling above. Bit by bit, these small details became part of the collective memory of the community. Somewhere along this stretch of time, no specific moment recorded, no single person credited, knowledge began to weave itself into a deeper form. What had once been everyday observation evolved into intentional understanding, and with understanding came confidence. People learned that if you watched a particular star rise just behind the peak of a neighbouring island, you could follow it by night and arrive safely. They learned that certain cloud shapes formed when sunlight reflected off a hidden lagoon beyond the horizon. They noticed that when the swell pushed gently from the east without interruption, land might lie somewhere in that direction. The ocean was still immense and intimidating, but it no longer felt unknowable. It felt like a living presence, one that spoke in patterns, rhythms, and subtle shifts. In quiet moments, sitting in a canoe as the water lapped softly against the sides, a person could close their eyes and sense the direction of the nearest land simply from the feel of the swell beneath their body. Such skills were not yet perfected, but they were beginning to take root. Climate played its role too. In these early homelands, warm breezes carried the scent of flowering trees, and tropical rains fell in sudden sheets that refreshed the land. Rivers carved gentle paths through dense forests, and the land itself offered abundance. Taro growing in damp earth, breadfruit hanging heavy from wide branches, and fish shimmering in the shallows. Yet plentiful as these islands were, they had their limits. Populations grew, families expanded, new land was needed, or at least new opportunities, to fish in fresher waters, to gather from richer reefs, to explore the possibility of life beyond the familiar horizon. And so, curiosity began to mingle with necessity. The first significant voyages were not dramatic leaps into the unknown. They were gradual steps outward. People travelled between archipelagos separated by greater distances. They began to venture far enough that entire islands disappeared from sight, and for the first time, the open ocean surrounded them on all sides. On these journeys, paddlers felt the vulnerability of being small in a world of vast water, but they also felt something else. The steady, reassuring repetition of the natural signs they had learned. The sea, it turned out, spoke the same language even far from home. Years blended into generations, and generation after generation added to the body of knowledge. What worked was preserved, what failed was remembered, so that no family would repeat the same mistake. In time, the canoes themselves evolved. Craftsmen experimented with shaping hulls that sliced more smoothly through water. They discovered ways to lash planks together in patterns that flexed with the swell rather than resisted it. They refined the structure of outriggers, learned to balance them on both sides, and eventually created the earliest forms of double-hulled vessels. Even at this early stage, canoe building was more art than labour. Each piece of timber was selected with ceremony. The wood was carved with careful strokes, smoothed until the hands of the builder recognised every curve. Entire families participated, some preparing the ropes made from coconut fibre, others treating the sails with oils that protected them from salt and sun. Building a canoe was building a future, and each vessel was treated with reverence accordingly. As these communities grew more confident in their ability to move across the sea, the role of navigator slowly emerged, not as a formal title at first, but as a natural result of skill. Certain individuals, often chosen from childhood, showed an unusual sensitivity to the patterns of the ocean. They could anticipate shifts in wind before the palm trees rustled. They could look at the texture of the clouds and sense whether a storm would form by nightfall. They could point to stars no one else had yet learned to name. These future navigators were trained not through written knowledge. There were no charts or parchment, but through long hours of practice. They lay on the platform of a canoe and closed their eyes, letting the rocking motion imprint itself in their memory. They spent evenings gazing upward, tracing paths from one star to another, learning not just their positions, but their rising times and seasonal shifts. They walked along the shoreline and listened to the distant crash of waves against unseen reefs, building an internal map of where those hidden landforms must lie. By now, the horizon had become something different in their minds. It was no longer a boundary, but a doorway, one that opened into possibilities rather than closing them off. The night sky, too, became more than a curtain of lights. It became a pathway. Each constellation served as a stepping stone, each star a marker on a silent, dependable road. And while the ocean still held mysteries, these navigators had begun to understand how to exist within its rhythms without fear. Still, even with all this growing knowledge, life remained deeply connected to the land. Villages bustled with activity in morning hours, women preparing taro in clay-lined pits, children collecting shells near the tide pools, men checking the condition of their nets. The scent of roasted breadfruit drifted through the air, mixing with the fragrance of crushed pandanus leaves. At midday, heat shimmered across the sand, and the ocean sparkled as though scattered with tiny fragments of glass. But by evening, attention always returned to the sky. The elders could often be seen sitting at the edge of the beach, their silhouettes outlined by the last light of the sun. They watched the stars emerge one by one. They murmured quiet observations to the young. This star rises earlier than last season, that one is beginning its long climb toward midsummer. Another is sinking lower than before. These nightly patterns, repeated over and over through time, shaped not only navigation but culture itself. Songs referenced the stars. Stories used them as characters. Even the rhythms of festivals aligned with celestial events. And in this gentle world, where tradition flowed smoothly from one generation to the next, the foundation was laid for something remarkable: the emergence of one of the greatest voyaging cultures in human history. The knowledge was quiet still, humble and rooted in daily life, but it was growing, gathering strength like a tide preparing to rise. And somewhere, far beyond the horizon, islands waited, lush, untouched and silent, unaware that someday sails woven from plant fibers and filled with warm trade winds would appear on their distant shores, carrying people guided not by instruments or metal tools, but by memory, intuition, and the eternal glow of the stars. As the night deepens and the air cools around the quiet village, the first navigators lie awake beneath the open sky. They are listening to the sea, to the wind, to the quiet turning of the world itself. Their minds rest on the edge of discovery, and soon their descendants will push beyond everything known, carried forward by wisdom that is only beginning to unfold. The calm of early morning often revealed the first silhouettes of the canoes, simple vessels resting just above the tide line, their curved hulls glistening faintly with dew. These early canoes were modest in size, carved from single logs pulled from forest trees, with straight trunks and dense, water-resistant wood. Yet even in their simplicity, they carried the promise of transformation. The people who crafted them understood that a canoe was not merely a tool for travel. It was a companion, a living bridge between land and sea. In these early centuries, the waters near the island shores were gentle enough for short journeys, but further out, where the reef dropped away and the deep ocean began, the waves grew unpredictable. A single-hulled canoe, no matter how well balanced, could roll too easily under the pressure of rising swells. Fishermen returning from a long day at sea had learned this the hard way. They knew the sensation of a wave shifting beneath them, tipping the canoe in a slow, uncertain arc. They knew the cold shock of being thrown into the water and the scramble to right their craft before it drifted away. Necessity, quiet and persistent, inspired change. The earliest innovation came in the form of a single curved spar attached to one side of the canoe. This spar, made from a lightweight tree branch, extended outward from the hull and connected to a second, smaller float, a simple piece of wood shaped to skim along the water's surface. This was the first outrigger, unassuming yet transformative. With it, the canoe could resist the sideways force of waves. The outrigger acted like a supportive arm, keeping the vessel steady even in restless water. Children gathered on the beach to watch as the craftsmen fitted these new attachments. The builders used ropes twisted from coconut fibers, each strand softened by rubbing it against their hands, their knees, or smooth stones until the fibers lay flat and strong. They tied the lashings with confident motions, weaving patterns taught by fathers, grandfathers, and generations before. Each knot held not just wood together, but family memory. Once the outrigger was secured, the canoe's shape changed in the eyes of those who looked upon it. What had been a simple craft now appeared balanced, purposeful, something designed not just for nearby waters, but for journeys that might extend farther. The first attempts at testing these new vessels were cautious. A fisherman stepped into the canoe with slow care, one hand steadying the hull, his weight leaning slightly toward the outrigger. As he pushed away from the shore, the canoe moved forward with smooth confidence, gliding over the shallows as if freed from an old hesitation. By midday, as word spread, others took their turns. Some paddled only a short distance before turning back. Others ventured farther, daring themselves to cross beyond the familiar line where the reef met open sea. Those who returned carried wide smiles and telltale droplets of excitement on their skin. The outrigger held firm. The canoe remained steady. This stability changed everything. With newfound confidence, communities expanded their fishing grounds. They reached deeper waters where larger fish swam in shimmering schools, their silver bodies catching the sun beneath the waves. They ventured to reefs that had once been too distant to approach safely, gathering shells and sea cucumbers, collecting coral stones used for sharpening tools. The ocean felt more accessible, more predictable, yet no less wondrous. As families began to rely on outrigger canoes for daily life, their design evolved quickly. Craftsmen refined the angle of the spars, noticing that certain inclinations allowed the canoe to cut more smoothly through oncoming waves. They experimented with the shape and thickness of the float, learning that a lighter float raised slightly above the water provided just enough stability without dragging. They adjusted the length of the hull, widening some canoes for cargo and narrowing others for speed. These developments brought subtle cultural shifts as well. A canoe was no longer something a single person could build alone. It became a communal project. When a tree was chosen for carving, there were quiet rituals observed, soft words offered to the forest, a respectful touch to the bark, a shared understanding that the tree's spirit would accompany the vessel on its journeys. When the canoe was shaped, sanded, and lashed, families took turns bringing food and drink to the builders. The creation of a canoe became a gesture of cooperation, a symbol of unity. With more reliable canoes came more reliable communication between islands. Villages that once knew one another only from infrequent visits now exchanged goods more often. Baskets woven from fragrant pandanus leaves, smooth stone tools, decorated mats, and bundles of dried food travelled back and forth across short channels. Friendships deepened, families intermarried, songs and stories spread, carrying news of births, successful harvests, and seasonal changes. The ocean, once a barrier, became a connector. As the outrigger became common, navigational skills advanced with it. Young apprentices were encouraged to sit near the front of the canoe, where they could observe how the bow cut through different kinds of waves. They learned to watch for the faintest change in the colour of the water, a deeper shade of blue indicating depth, a cloudier turquoise, suggesting the presence of sandbanks or shoals. They practiced reading the breeze by the movement of their own hair, or by how the edges of the sail fluttered. Their teachers spoke softly so as not to disturb the natural sounds around them. "Listen to the sea," they said. "It tells you where it is shallow, where it is deep, and where you must be patient." They instructed the young to feel the canoe's motion with their whole body, not just with their eyes. A slight lift beneath the hull might reveal a shift in the swell. A long rolling sensation might indicate the presence of land beyond sight. As these practices became part of everyday life, the people grew increasingly attuned to the world around them. They could predict when distant storms would send strong waves toward their island long before dark clouds appeared. They recognized when the migration of certain birds signaled seasonal changes. They could tell from the taste of the wind whether dry weather or rainfall was approaching. With each generation, knowledge accumulated and passed forward. Lessons learned by grandparents were refined by parents, and then given to children who would someday improve them further. The outrigger, stable and reliable, became the vessel through which this growing knowledge travelled. There were nights, quiet, windless nights, when the canoes rested on the sand, and families gathered near them to share meals and stories. Children played in the soft glow of firelight, casting long shadows against the curved hulls. The sound of waves lapping gently against the shore formed a comforting background, steady and familiar. In those moments, the canoes felt like sleeping guardians, their wooden frames holding the secrets of countless journeys. Slowly, as communities expanded their reach, they began to wonder again about what lay farther out. They had crossed the channels between close islands. They had followed birds to neighbouring shores. They had learned to trust the outriggers' balance and their own growing skill. Yet the horizon still stretched beyond them, distant and unbroken. There were stories whispered by travellers of islands that lay far away, beyond the reach of ordinary vision. Some claimed to have seen unusual cloud formations or flocks of birds flying in long, purposeful lines toward open sea. Others recalled dreamlike tales passed down from ancestors who spoke of land emerging from the ocean like sleeping giants. Whether these stories were real or imagined hardly mattered. They awakened something, curiosity. Curiosity mixed with confidence, and confidence mixed with possibility. And so, while the first outriggers had been invented to navigate restless coastal waters, they unknowingly prepared the way for a much greater chapter. Within these simple vessels lay the seeds of the extraordinary voyages to come. The voyages that would eventually span thousands of miles across open ocean, connecting distant islands into one vast cultural world. For now, though, the people stood on the shore at dusk, watching the last colours of daylight soften across the water. The tide moved in with a gentle hush, sliding beneath the hulls of the canoes as if encouraging them to rise and journey once more. The stars brightened overhead, steady and ancient, waiting patiently for the moment when someone would look up, observe their patterns, and decide it was time to follow them farther than ever before. As the first outriggers grew familiar across the island's shores, a new form of understanding began to unfold, an understanding not centered on tools or craftsmanship, but on the quiet language of the ocean itself. For the people of these early communities, the sea was no longer simply a path or a source of food. It became a teacher, one whose lessons arrived not through spoken words, but through steady rhythms, subtle vibrations, and gentle shifts that could be felt through the hull of a canoe, or even through bare feet placed upon the sand. Children learned this language long before they understood its significance. When they played near the tide pools, they could feel how the water tugged at their ankles more insistently during certain phases of the moon. They listened to the rattle of pebbles rolling in and out with the surf, noticing that the sound changed when a storm brewed far offshore. They splashed and laughed, but beneath the laughter, small seeds of awareness were forming. The sea spoke softly at first, and those who spent their lives close to it gradually learned how to hear it. By adolescence, when a young person was first invited to join a canoe journey beyond the reef, their senses had already been trained by years of unconscious practice. The elders knew this. They watched how the youth walked across a canoe deck, noting where their weight fell, whether they instinctively leaned into the wind, whether they braced themselves at the right moment when a rising swell approached. Lessons began quietly, without ceremony. "Sit here," an elder might say, tapping a place near the center of the canoe. "Close your eyes, tell me when the swell changes." And the apprentice would sit, the warm scent of sun-dried planks rising around them, the light spray of seawater touching their skin. At first, they felt nothing but the general rocking of the vessel. But soon, the subtler patterns emerged. A long, even roll signaled deep ocean beneath. A shorter, quicker pitch hinted at reefs or shallows. If a second, smaller wave pattern crossed the first, it might come from land hidden beyond sight. "It is speaking to you," the elder would murmur. "Do not rush to answer, only listen." Listening became the foundation of navigation. During long, quiet afternoons, the apprentices practiced reading the surface of the sea. They observed how patches of darker water revealed depth, while lighter streaks, where sunlight reflected sharply, might indicate shallower sandbars or underwater ridges. They learned the movement of wind shadows, dark, rippling patches on the water, where gusts danced lightly before fading again. They learned how certain fish swam close to floating debris, and how the presence of drifting vegetation sometimes hinted at nearby land swept clean by storms. Each detail mattered. Nothing was dismissed as unimportant. As these young learners grew older, their instruction deepened. The elders taught them to watch the horizon, not with narrow focus, but with relaxed, sweeping attention. A gathering of clouds over one distant point might suggest warm air rising from an island's lush forests. A line of birds moving with unusual purpose could mean nesting grounds ahead. Even the way light shimmered on morning waves, smooth on one side, slightly broken on the other, could reveal the arrival of a faint crosswind. And then there was the wind itself. The wind had moods: friendly, restless, sharp, shy. It carried scents as messages: the smell of rain before any dark cloud appeared, the earthy aroma of distant land drifting across miles of water, the faint sweetness of blooming trees carried offshore. Navigators learned to inhale deeply before each journey, as though letting the wind speak directly to them. "Listen to the wind as you would listen to a story," they were told. "It begins quietly, it builds, and then it reveals what it has to say." Some winds whispered low across the sea, barely brushing the surface. Others arrived in playful bursts, rattling the edges of the sail. There were winds that warmed the skin and winds that chilled it. Winds that helped you forward and winds that resisted. The navigators named them all, not formally, but through familiarity. They knew the feel of each, the way one might know the mannerisms of a close friend. When the time came for a longer voyage between islands, the apprentices watched as experienced navigators tested the air, holding out strands of coconut fibre or thin leaves to see how they fluttered. They observed how the elders waited for the exact moment when the wind shifted into a favourable position, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, sometimes days, before lifting the sail. Patience was part of the language too. There were nights when the sea was still and glass-like, reflecting the stars with perfect clarity. Such nights held a special silence, broken only by the gentle creak of canoe lashings and the faint splash of paddles dipping in unhurried rhythm. On these nights, the navigators felt as though they were gliding across the sky itself. They measured their progress by the movement of constellations overhead, noting how one star rose higher while another drifted behind. During these calm passages, apprentices continued their quiet education. An elder might gesture toward the water with a nod. "Feel how the swell continues from the east. That swell has travelled far. It remembers land." And so the apprentice would lie back, close their eyes and feel, not merely imagine, the direction of distant shores. Other nights brought unsettled seas. The swell rolled unevenly beneath the canoe, and the wind shifted directions more often than anyone preferred. Even in these conditions, learning continued. The elders explained how to sense confusion in the water, how to read the timing of waves pushed by faraway storms, how to recognize when the ocean urged caution. Not every day is meant for travel, they reminded the apprentices. Some days are meant for waiting. Waiting is wisdom. These teachings wove themselves into the rhythm of life. The people did not separate the act of listening from the act of living. To know the sea was to know themselves, their patience, their resilience, their humility. The ocean did not reward haste or impulsiveness, and so neither did the culture that grew beside it. But perhaps the most subtle lessons came at dawn, when the world seemed to hold its breath. Apprentices stood barefoot on the sand as the sun began its slow ascent. They felt the coolness of the earth beneath them, the faint stirrings of the morning breeze, the distant roar of breakers beyond the reef. They observed how the water changed colour, from deep blue to softer turquoise, then to shimmering silver. These transitions taught them about light, depth, and direction. The elders would stand beside them, silent for long stretches. Teaching did not always require words. Sometimes the simple presence of the sea, unfolding in its natural rhythms, was enough. As time passed, these learners grew into confident young adults, able to interpret the sea's language with increasing fluency. They could step into a canoe and sense its balance instantly, adjusting their weight before the vessel even reacted. They could predict the first stirrings of an approaching storm by the shape of the clouds alone. They understood how the colour of the horizon just after sunset could reveal changes in the weather for the next day. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, these skills began pointing toward a larger destiny. The people were no longer content to merely travel between familiar islands. They had begun noticing signs that suggested more land lay farther away, patterns in bird migration, unusual swells arriving from distant directions, clouds gathering over invisible peaks. Every message the sea offered hinted at something beyond the known world. The horizon was widening. The ocean no longer felt like an endless expanse, but like a map, waiting to be read by those who had learned its language well enough to trust its guidance. And so, while their canoes remained simple and their tools remained humble, the minds of the navigators were expanding outward, reaching farther with each season. Soon, these early voyagers would take steps toward journeys that exceeded anything their ancestors had imagined. They would push beyond the comfortable waters. Guided by intuition sharpened through years of listening, they would follow the currents, the winds, and the stars into new realms of discovery. But before those great voyages could begin, there was one more essential skill to master, one that would become the heart of all future exploration. And that skill waited in the night sky, shimmering patiently for those who knew how to look upward. Night after night, the people gathered along the beach or upon the raised platforms of their homes, watching as the first stars pierced the darkening sky. These early points of light appeared familiar, almost comforting, yet to the navigators, they were far more than ornaments. They were markers, steady, ancient, and precise, hung across the heavens in patterns that could guide a canoe across the open sea. While the ocean whispered its language through waves and currents, the stars offered a quieter, more constant voice, one that carried the wisdom of centuries. Long before these communities ventured into distant waters, the sky had already become their teacher. Children would lie on woven mats at night, gazing upward as soft breezes travelled inland from the lagoon. Elders traced lines between stars with gentle movements of the hand, creating shapes that had lived in stories for generations. These shapes were not merely constellations. They were reminders of direction, of seasons, of the long cycles of the year. Some stars rose straight from the ocean's edge, creating a clear vertical path between water and sky. Others moved along arcs so subtle that only those who watched them night after night understood where they would travel next. Over time, these celestial pathways became etched into memory, and memory, in a world without written maps, served as the single most faithful library. Perhaps the first great revelation came when someone noticed that a star rising from a particular point on the horizon always marked a dependable direction. Season after season, it returned to the same place. At first, this pattern simply offered a sense of comfort, a reassurance that some things remained constant in a shifting world. But slowly, purpose emerged. If a canoe travelled toward the rising point of a known star, it could follow its path even when the sea seemed endless. The people began giving names to these guiding lights. Some were named for birds that migrated through the region, others for animals or ancestors who were honoured in song. Each name carried meaning and a story, and through these stories the stars became familiar companions. Navigators could speak of them as one might speak of friends. This star rises kindly, that one sets with strength, another appears only when rains are near. It was the beginning of a celestial map. These early star paths were not drawn in sand nor carved into wood. They were carried in the mind, in patterns, in sequences, in rhythms memorized until they became second nature. A navigator might recite them silently before sleep or hum them softly while repairing a canoe. Songs were created with melodies that rose and fell like the stars themselves, each verse serving as a reminder of direction. The sky became a kind of living chant, and those who understood it could travel without fear. The most gifted navigators developed a remarkable skill. They learned to imagine the world as one enormous dome, with the stars sliding across it in graceful movement. In daylight, when the sky appeared empty, the navigators could still picture where each star slept. They understood that even when out of sight, the stars followed dependable paths beneath the horizon, waiting to rise again in their appointed time. This inner map allowed them to prepare for voyages long before darkness fell. The rising stars were only part of the story. Some stars served as anchors in the night sky, fixed points around which everything else rotated. These anchoring stars gave stability to the navigator's mental map. Others dipped close to the horizon before vanishing, marking seasonal changes and shifts in weather. The navigators learned to trace these movements with extraordinary precision. These skills were never taught hurriedly. They were passed on in long, patient lessons, lessons that sometimes lasted hours, sometimes seasons, sometimes years. A young apprentice might spend a full year studying just one section of the sky, learning how its stars behaved after storms, during full moons, or in the stillness of early morning. Each observation deepened their understanding. Each night added another piece to the great puzzle. One of the most important teachings was the star compass, a conceptual circle divided into regions aligned with the horizon. Each region contained specific stars that rose or set within it. To an outsider, the compass might have seemed invisible, but to navigators, it was as real as the canoe beneath them. By memorizing which stars belonged to which region, they could maintain course even when clouds obscured the sky. If one star vanished behind thick cloud cover, they could simply follow the next in sequence. In this way, navigation became a dance between certainty and adaptation. When the night sky was clear, the stars offered steadfast guidance. But when clouds gathered or rains fell, the navigators turned again to the waves, the wind, and the feel of the canoe. The sea and sky worked together, never contradicting each other. If a navigator felt the swell shift beneath the canoe, they knew exactly which stars accompanied such a swell, even if those stars were hidden. It was a harmony of knowledge, each element supporting the other. Elders often reminded apprentices that stars were not simply guides, they were echoes of ancestral wisdom. Many stories held that the first navigators were taught by beings who understood both sea and sky. Whether those stories were myth or memory hardly mattered. They reinforced the belief that navigation was sacred work, entrusted to those with patience, humility, and deep respect for the world around them. These teachings shaped not only the skills of the navigators, but the rhythm of entire communities. When certain stars appeared at dusk, villages prepared for seasonal changes, new planting cycles, shifts in fishing grounds, or times when long voyages became possible. The appearance of specific constellations signaled when sea turtles would lay eggs, when certain fish would gather in large numbers, or when gentle winds would settle in for predictable weeks. The entire community lived within the cadence of the sky. And within this celestial rhythm, a subtle desire began to grow. Each time navigators traced the rising points of distant stars, they sensed the possibility of land far beyond their familiar horizon. They imagined islands resting beneath the very skies that guided them each night. The stars hinted at continuity. If they could be followed across one sea, why not another? If their arc stretched beyond known waters, perhaps land awaited wherever the sky eventually touched the ocean. This quiet belief spread through the community, sometimes voiced aloud, sometimes kept as a quiet dream. People spoke of islands that must surely exist, hidden beyond the reach of sight, but not beyond the reach of the stars. They imagined new shores, new forests, new reefs, new lives. Not out of restlessness, but out of harmony with a world that seemed to invite exploration. For now, though, they studied the sky with disciplined care. They learned not to rush. The ocean would reveal its pathways when the time was right. The stars would show which direction to follow and when to begin, and the people would be ready, not with hurried ambition, but with steady, patient understanding. Night after night, the constellations rose and set along their ancient paths. The navigators watched them closely, memorizing their positions, their angles, their seasonal shifts. These patterns would lead them across thousands of miles of open water, through darkness and storms, through calm seas and bright horizons. And soon, when the first great voyages began, the stars would guide the canoes like luminous guardians stretched across the endless deep. But before those voyages could unfold, something else awaited. An evolution not of the sky, but of society itself. For the people who studied the stars were about to shape communities built not merely on survival, but on voyaging as a way of life. In the generations that followed the first careful study of stars, a quiet change began to ripple across the islands, one not sparked by a single event, but by hundreds of small decisions made under the glow of moonlight and around the warmth of evening fires. The people had learned the language of the sea. They had begun to follow the pathways of stars. And with each passing season, they grew more confident in their ability to move not just between nearby islands, but across greater stretches of ocean. This new understanding didn't simply influence how they travelled, it slowly reshaped how they lived. Villages that once existed as independent clusters of families began to orient themselves around the art of voyaging. Canoes became more than tools. They became the heart of community identity. A completed canoe was celebrated not as an object, but as a vessel of connection. When it slid into the water for the first time, people gathered along the shore, their voices rising in soft chants that thanked the forest for the tree, the artisans for their skill, and the sea for its future protection. Within these communities, canoes were treated almost like living members of society. Each one had a personality. Some glided smoothly across calm water, others danced lightly over choppy seas. Elders remembered which canoes had weathered storms, which had carried families to safety, and which had discovered new fishing grounds. Their names reflected their character, names that translated to gentle wave, clear horizon, or bird of the morning. Craftsmen who shaped these vessels grew into respected figures within their societies. Their knowledge was intricate and deeply intuitive. They selected wood not only for strength, but for harmony, understanding that a canoe built from timber cut at the wrong phase of the moon or lashed with unseasoned rope might be untrustworthy. They studied how the grain curved, how the wood responded when carved, how it resonated with a gentle knock of the knuckles. Such awareness required patience and quiet observation, traits deeply valued by their people. Around these craftsmen, a new generation of helpers emerged. Young apprentices carried water, gathered resin, and sliced thin fibers from coconut husks. Their hands grew strong from twisting ropes, and their minds grew sharp from listening to the elders' stories as they worked. In these stories, the apprentices heard not only technical lessons, but reminders of humility, respect, and the interconnectedness of all things. As canoe building flourished, so too did the structure of society. Families organized themselves around the roles needed for voyaging. Some specialized in gathering and preparing foods that would last through long journeys. Dried fish, pressed coconut, fermented breadfruit. Others wove sails from the leaves of pandanus, or prepared small gifts to offer at new islands, tokens of peace and goodwill. Women, especially, carried knowledge of plants, medicine, and weaving traditions that kept the voyagers safe and well. Even the layout of villages subtly shifted over time. Houses positioned themselves closer to the shoreline. Storage pits for food expanded. Meeting areas were built to hold larger gatherings as families from neighbouring islands visited more often. Trade flourished. Nets, tools, barkcloth, and pottery exchanged hands with a sense of mutual respect. No one travelled only for themselves. Every voyage strengthened the connections between far-flung relatives. And at the centre of these developments stood the navigators. Navigators held a unique place in society, respected, trusted, yet never boasting of their abilities. Their role required a rare blend of mental discipline and spiritual calm. They spent long hours at night gazing at the stars, rehearsing the celestial map in their minds. During the day, they walked along beaches to feel the wind, studied waves breaking across the reef, and observed the flight paths of seabirds. They lived in a gentle balance between the physical and the intuitive. When a voyage was proposed, whether for exploration, trade, or family reunion, the navigator gathered the community. They spoke softly, explaining the coming season's winds, the behavior of the currents, and the readiness of the canoes. These gatherings had a peaceful rhythm. People listened quietly, their trust anchored not in blind faith, but in the steady accuracy of generations who had read the world around them with extraordinary sensitivity. Before any journey, rituals grounded the travellers. There were offerings made to the ancestors, not in fear, but in gratitude. The voyagers dipped their hands in seawater as a symbolic gesture of joining with the ocean. They touched the hull of the canoe to feel its strength. They embraced family members who stayed behind, knowing that all voyages were both departures and returns. They held joy and longing in equal measure. For younger members of the community, voyages became passages of growth. Being chosen to join a journey was a moment of quiet pride. It meant they were ready to learn more deeply from the sea. It meant they were trusted to help paddle through long hours, to tend the sail, to watch the horizon, and to honour the crew with steady presence. On their first voyage, many found themselves in awe of how vast the world truly was, how the sky curved full above them, how the ocean stretched endlessly, how stars responded to their movement as though guiding them personally. On long crossings, the canoe became a floating village. Each person had a role. Some paddled in measured rhythm. Others tended the provisions. Some kept watch as the night deepened, listening for changes in the wind. There were moments of storytelling and moments of silence, moments of laughter when the sea was calm, and moments of stillness when the horizon darkened with approaching weather. The bond between crew members grew strong, woven by shared work, shared trust, and shared responsibility. A canoe could not be navigated by one person alone. It was the strength of the group that allowed it to move forward. And so each voyage became a lesson in unity, patience, and mutual care. When a canoe approached a distant island, the feeling was unmistakable. Land signaled itself long before it appeared. The colour of the water changed. Clouds gathered above invisible peaks. Seabirds flew purposefully toward their roosts. The navigators felt these signs with practiced certainty. Then, often at dawn, the first shadow of land would take form on the horizon. Blue at first, then green, then detail with cliffs, trees, and gently rising hills. The joy of arrival was shared by all. They greeted the new island with quiet reverence, stepping onto its shore as though entering the home of a friend. They listened to its sounds, the rustle of leaves, the songs of unfamiliar birds, the murmur of streams. They tasted its fruits, learned its currents, and exchanged gifts with its people. Sometimes, explorers returned home with stories of new lands. Sometimes they stayed behind to help new branches of their culture flourish. Over time, these voyaging societies created networks that stretched across vast oceanic regions. The ocean no longer separated them. It linked them in a tapestry of stories, language, and ancestry. Canoes became the threads that wove this tapestry, moving gently but surely between islands. Yet even as communities grew more connected, a new question began to form. Quiet, persistent, curious. If voyagers could travel this far, what lay beyond the next horizon? If the stars had led them across these seas, might they not also lead them into a world still farther away? This question, soft yet profound, stirred in the hearts of navigators, craftsmen, families, and children alike. And soon, It would set the stage for the most ambitious journeys their world had ever known. As voyaging societies strengthened their traditions and deepened their understanding of the sea and sky, a much older story, one whispered across centuries, began to stir within the collective memory of the people. This story reached beyond their island clusters, beyond the familiar ocean channels they had long travelled, into a distant past where their ancestors had first begun to move outward from lands far to the west. It was a story of curiosity, resilience, and slow, steady migration. A story of countless generations drifting not aimlessly, but purposefully, guided by wisdom that grew with every journey. Long before the great Polynesian world took shape, the earliest Austronesian peoples lived along the rich coastlines of Taiwan and nearby regions. Their world was lush, full of rivers, fertile soil, and abundant marine life. Life there, balanced between land and sea, much like their descendants' lives would millennia later. Yet even in this early beginning, there was a distinct restlessness woven into their way of life, a gentle pull drawing them to explore what lay beyond their immediate shores. No single moment launched these migrations. They happened gradually, almost like the steady push of a tide. Families moved in small groups at first, travelling to nearby islands in search of new fishing grounds or more spacious land for cultivation. As these families settled new places, they carried with them their language, their stories, their canoes, and their deep respect for the sea. With each new settlement, their culture adapted, blended, and strengthened. As centuries passed, these migrations carried Austronesian communities farther south, reaching the northern Philippines. These islands offered new challenges: mountainous terrain, shifting weather, and rich biodiversity. But they also provided new opportunities. People learned to cultivate new plants, to fish in deeper waters, and to communicate across greater distances. Their canoes improved. Their understanding of the stars expanded. Their confidence grew. Eventually, their journeys pushed them eastward into the vast archipelagos of Southeast Asia. They navigated among thousands of islands scattered like jewels across the ocean. Each time a family found a new home, they planted crops, raised children, and shared their knowledge with their neighbours. Yet always, some small group felt the quiet call to journey farther. In these early migrations, there was no single leader urging them onward. Instead, movement was a natural expression of curiosity and adaptation. When land became crowded or resources grew thin, people travelled in search of balance. When a distant island beckoned with its cloud patterns or bird migrations, explorers took to the sea. The ocean, though unpredictable at times, offered pathways rather than barriers. Eventually, this steady movement carried the Austronesian people into Melanesia, lands rich in rugged coastlines, volcanic soils, and vibrant forest life. Here, they encountered communities who had lived on these islands for tens of thousands of years. The two groups exchanged traditions, language patterns, tools, and techniques. Some intermarried, creating new cultural blends that endured for generations. Through these interactions, the voyagers learned new strategies for survival in diverse environments, knowledge that would later strengthen their long journeys across open ocean. They refined their navigation methods, deepened their canoe-building expertise, and expanded their understanding of the winds and currents that flowed through the region. But these islands, beautiful and diverse as they were, did not mark the end of their wandering. Far to the east lay a world unlike anything they had yet encountered. a vast stretch of ocean with only small, scattered islands breaking its surface. These islands lay far beyond the horizon, hidden behind the curve of the sea. No towering mountains marked their presence. No river mouths signalled their shores. Only subtle signs, patterns in wind, waves, and the paths of seabirds hinted that land might be waiting. For generations, these hints remained untested. The distance was intimidating. The sea between Melanesia and the farther eastern islands was wide and often unpredictable. But as the voyaging societies grew more adept, as their canoes improved and their star knowledge deepened, the unvisited horizon began to call to them with renewed strength. Navigators gathered in the calm of evening, tracing star paths in the air with thoughtful hands. They spoke of swells that seemed to carry the memory of distant landforms. They described long flights of birds that disappeared toward the rising sun. They observed cloud shapes that formed only above certain types of islands. The clues were subtle, but not invisible. Families listened to these observations with quiet contemplation. They understood that venturing into the deep unknown required not only skill, but community devotion. Such voyages would not be undertaken lightly. They would require strong canoes, steady winds, and hearts prepared for long days and uncertain nights. Yet the desire persisted. It grew slowly but surely, like roots seeking water beneath the soil. A belief took shape that the world was far larger than they had ever imagined, and that it was not meant to be feared, but explored with respect. In time, the people began preparing for these greater journeys. They built stronger canoes, sometimes joining two hulls together to form double-hulled vessels with greater stability and space. They wove larger sails, sturdy yet flexible, capable of harnessing even light winds. They stored food with meticulous care, pressing fruits into long-lasting forms and drying fish until it kept through changing weather. They carried tools, seeds, and treasured traditions, symbols of the life they hoped to continue wherever they might land. These preparations brought communities together in shared purpose. Children gathered coconuts and firewood. Adults crafted ropes and repaired lashings. Elders offered wisdom and calm, reminding everyone that they travelled not alone, but with the guidance of ancestors who had moved across smaller seas for generations. Each part of the community had a place in the preparations, and each contribution mattered. The moment of departure for such voyages was always serene. There was no fanfare or loud celebration. Instead, the people gathered quietly along the shore at dawn. The canoes waited on the sand, their hulls gleaming with oil, their sails folded like resting wings. Voyagers stepped forward one by one, embracing their families, offering soft words of reassurance, and inhaling the last familiar scent of home for many days to come. And when they pushed off into the water, the village remained on the shore until the canoes became small shapes on the horizon. Even then, families stood watching, sending their hopes and blessings across the sea. This moment, repeated across centuries, across countless islands, marked the beginning of the Great Austronesian Expansion into the remote Pacific. It was not one migration, but many, not one voyage, but thousands. A gentle yet persistent unfolding of human curiosity and resilience. These migrations form the roots of what would later become the vast Polynesian world. The people who undertook them carried memories of their ancestors, skills honed over generations, and an unwavering trust in the sea, the wind, and the stars. They did not see themselves as wanderers, but as caretakers of knowledge moving through space and time. And soon, these voyagers would cross one of the most challenging stretches of ocean on the planet, an expanse so wide and so empty that only the most skilled, patient, and attuned navigators could cross it. Yet cross it they would, guided by the rhythms of waves, the breath of winds, and the eternal map of the stars overhead. The great canoes rocked softly in the pale light of early dawn, their twin hulls resting against the shallow waves as if gathering calm before the vastness ahead. Around them, the air carried a hush of anticipation, gentle but unmistakably alive. Families gathered on the shore, their eyes lingering on the voyagers preparing to leave. Some held woven baskets of food and gifts. Others stood quietly with hands folded, drawing strength from the moment. No one spoke loudly. Even the youngest children sensed the gravity of what was unfolding. Beyond the reef lay a stretch of ocean, unlike anything they had crossed before. A great blue desert, wide and seemingly endless, where no mountains reached skyward to signal land. Only the rhythm of the swells and the luminous pathways of the stars would guide them. And yet, despite the immensity of the task, the voyagers stood steady, grounded by traditions older than memory. The navigators approached the canoes with a calmness that had been earned through years of deep listening. Their feet padded across the sand, leaving faint impressions soon washed smooth by the tide. Each navigator carried in their mind a detailed map, a map not of lines or ink, but of sensations, directions, stars, and sequences of rising and setting lights. It was a map that shifted not with weather or distance, but with the very turning of the world. As the moment of departure neared, the voyagers knelt beside the canoes. Some placed their palms against the warm wood, whispering words of gratitude. Others touched their foreheads gently to the hulls, acknowledging the vessel as both a guardian and a companion. These gestures were not ritual in the sense of strict ceremony. They were acts of relationship, the continuation of generations who had learned to see the canoe as an extension of themselves. When the first canoe slid into the water, its hulls glided smoothly across the lagoon, leaving ripples that shimmered in the morning light. The second followed, and then the third. As each passed beyond the shadow of the reef, the village fell quiet. The voyagers raised their hands in farewell, and soon the canoes became small shapes on the gleaming water, their sails folded like wings waiting for the right moment to rise. Once they reached the open sea, the navigators called for the sails to be unfurled. The woven mats caught the morning breeze and billowed outward, filling with the steady breath of the wind. The canoes leaned into motion, cutting through the water with quiet confidence. The horizon widened with every passing moment. The land behind them slowly blurred, softened, and finally disappeared, swallowed by distance. This was the beginning of a journey that would take them beyond the limits of sight, beyond the reach of familiar islands, and into waters no one in their generation had crossed. Yet even surrounded by such vast emptiness, the voyagers did not feel lost. The sea beneath them carried messages. The sky above them offered guidance, and the canoe beneath them felt steady, balanced, and alive. Early on, the seas remained gentle. The swells rolled consistently from the direction the navigators had anticipated, matching the memory of distant landforms that lay far ahead. The voyagers paddled in long, even strokes, though the sails did most of the work. Their movements were quiet and synchronized, creating a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the sea. During the day, the navigators stood near the front of the canoe. Their eyes swept the horizon, noting the slightest changes in the colour of the water, the shape of distant clouds, or the behaviour of birds that might appear unexpectedly. They tasted the wind on their tongues, feeling its coolness or warmth, its dryness or moisture. Each detail told a story. When the sun reached its highest point, the light shimmered so brightly across the sea that the water seemed to glow. The voyagers shielded their eyes with woven mats or cloth. Some rested, lying on the crossbeams between the hulls, their bodies rising and falling gently with the motion of the canoe. The wood beneath them warmed in the sun, releasing the faint scent of the forest it had once been part of. Meals were simple: dried fish softened with seawater, coconut flesh, fermented breadfruit. The food nourished them without heaviness, keeping their bodies steady for long days of travel. Water was rationed carefully, its distribution a shared responsibility. Every sip was taken with gratitude and mindfulness. As days passed, the ocean revealed its many moods. Some afternoons brought calm seas, smooth and glass-like, reflecting the sky with such clarity that the world felt doubled. Other days brought playful winds that danced across the waves, causing the sails to flutter in quick bursts. The voyagers adjusted their course gently, trusting the knowledge of the navigator and the stability of the canoe. But there were also moments when the ocean grew restless. One evening, as the sun began to sink, streaks of dark clouds appeared on the horizon. The navigators watched closely. They sensed the shift in the wind, felt the tension of the water beneath the hulls. The air thickened with the scent of approaching rain. The voyagers tightened the lashings, secured the provisions, and lowered the sails slightly to reduce strain. When the storm arrived, it did so with sudden intensity. Rain fell in heavy sheets, drumming against the canoe and against their skin. The wind pushed from unpredictable directions, turning the surface of the sea into a restless tapestry of white foam and churning waves. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the clouds in brief, pale flashes. Yet even in the midst of chaos, the navigators remained calm. They crouched low, feeling the movement of the swells through the hulls, sensing the deeper rhythm beneath the surface confusion. They understood that storms were temporary, that beneath every wave there was a larger pulse guiding them forward. They directed the crew with soft, steady voices, keeping the canoe at an angle that allowed it to ride the waves rather than resist them. The voyagers moved with purpose, bailing water when necessary, securing ropes, keeping the canoe balanced. No one panicked. Their trust in one another held firm. They had been taught that storms were part of the ocean's language, not obstacles, but messages to interpret and respond to. When the storm finally passed, the sea lay calm again, as if exhaling softly after a moment of heavy breath. The voyagers rested, grateful for the resilience of their canoe and the guidance of their navigators. They checked their supplies, ensured no lashings had loosened, and tended to small bruises or tired muscles. Then they continued onward, the stars slowly appearing as night settled across the sky. Night at sea held its own kind of magic. The world seemed quieter in the darkness, the horizon blending seamlessly into sky. The navigators lay on their backs during calm hours, their heads near the edge of the canoe, their eyes fixed on the heavens above. Stars moved through their appointed paths with comforting precision. The navigators traced their sequences silently, following patterns they had memorized over years of practice. These night hours were moments of deep serenity. The only sounds were the gentle splash of water against the hull and the soft murmur of wind through the sail. Sometimes a fish leapt, briefly disturbing the stillness before disappearing again beneath the surface. The voyagers listened to these sounds with appreciation, knowing they were part of the ocean's endless heartbeat. As the voyage continued, signs of land began to appear long before anyone could see it. The swell changed subtly, rising against an unseen shore. Birds appeared. First a lone tern, then another, then whole flocks travelling in purposeful arcs across the sky. Cloud patterns shifted, gathering above a point on the horizon, as though resting over an island too distant to glimpse. The navigators felt these signs with certainty. Then, one morning, just before sunrise, a faint shape rose on the edge of the world. At first, it was little more than a shadow, but as the light grew, the shape became clearer, an outline of hills, softened by distance and mist. The voyagers leaned forward, eyes wide, yet calm. They whispered to one another, acknowledging the moment. Land. Its presence felt like a long-held breath finally exhaled. The voyagers paddled with renewed energy, moving steadily toward the island. As they drew closer, the smell of vegetation drifted across the water, earthy, warm, alive. The cries of seabirds grew louder, and soon the waves broke gently against the island's outer reef. When the canoes passed through the opening in the reef and entered the lagoon, the water shifted into brilliant shades of turquoise and green. The voyagers gazed at the new land with a quiet reverence. Trees swayed gently inland, their leaves shimmering in the morning light. The air was thick with the scent of flowers and fresh rain. The island felt like a promise fulfilled, one that had been sensed long before it was seen. As they stepped onto the soft sand, they carried with them the realization that the world was larger, more generous, and more connected than they had ever imagined. Their long crossing had proven that the blue desert was not empty. It was full of pathways revealed to those who listened deeply to the sea, trusted the stars, and moved forward with patience and courage. And this was only the beginning. More islands waited beyond this one, scattered across the great expanse like jewels hidden beneath clouds. The voyagers had crossed one of the longest and most challenging stretches of ocean on Earth, but they had done so with skill, grace, and unity. Now, as they settled briefly on this new shore, another quiet question began to rise. Gentle, persistent, familiar. If they had come this far, how much farther could they go? The island welcomed the voyagers with a stillness that felt almost sacred. As the canoes glided into the turquoise lagoon, the voyagers could hear the shift in the water's voice. No longer the long, rolling cadence of the open sea, but the softer, more intimate rhythm of sheltered shores. The lagoon wrapped around them like a protective arm, its surface dappled with sunlight filtering through drifting clouds. Here, the waves gentled into shimmering ripples, brushing against the hulls as if inviting the travellers to come ashore. The voyagers paused for a moment, allowing themselves to take in the beauty of the land before them. They breathed in deeply, letting the scent of flowers and damp earth settle into their memory. After weeks at sea, even the faint fragrance of leaves held a kind of magic. Birds circled overhead, some with long white wings, others with sharp, curious cries, as though greeting the newcomers with equal parts caution and curiosity. When the canoes finally slid onto the sand, the voyagers stepped onto the land with quiet reverence. Their feet sank gently into the warm grains, and a sense of stillness washed over them. No footsteps had marked this beach before. No smoke curled from inland fires. The island waited like an untouched canvas, ready for the first strokes of human presence. The navigators were often the first to walk inland. Their roles did not end with guiding the canoe. They also guided the first moments on shore. They moved with purpose, scanning the landscape for safe water sources, sheltered spaces, and signs of natural hazards. Yet they walked not as conquerors, but as guests. Each new island was treated with respect, approached with humility. The navigators carried with them the understanding that every shore had its own spirit, its own rhythm, its own personality. Behind them, the rest of the crew explored the beach. Some gathered driftwood to build a small fire. Others checked the canoes, ensuring that no lashings had loosened during the final approach. A few wandered along the shoreline, letting the warm water wash over their feet. There was no rush. The island would reveal itself in its own time. As the sun climbed higher, the voyagers formed small groups and moved inland. The path from the beach led them through stands of tall trees with smooth trunks and leaves that rustled like whispers. The ground beneath them was soft and springy, covered in fallen leaves that released a fresh, earthy scent when stepped upon. Birds flitted between branches, their calls echoing gently through the canopy. Some were bright and unfamiliar. Others resembled birds from home. At the centre of the island, they discovered clear streams fed by rainfall and hidden springs. The water sparkled as it flowed over smooth stones, creating soft murmurs that mingled with the wind. The voyagers knelt to drink, cupping their hands and savouring the cool sweetness that refreshed both body and spirit. Finding fresh water was always a moment of relief, a confirmation that the island could sustain life. Other discoveries soon followed. Coconut palms stood tall along the shoreline, offering food, water, and materials for rope and shelter. Thick clusters of wild bananas grew near the forest edge, their broad leaves shimmering under the sun, and everywhere the forest floor offered edible roots, medicinal plants, and signs of animals whose patterns the voyagers could learn in the days ahead. Each discovery added to the sense of possibility. As afternoon softened into evening, the voyagers returned to the beach, carrying baskets of fruit, armfuls of leaves, and small bundles of wood. A fire crackled near the canoes, sending up thin curls of smoke that rose into the deepening sky. The scent of roasting fish drifted across the sand, mingling with the sweetness of freshly gathered fruit. The voyagers sat together, sharing a meal that tasted both familiar and new. In the warm glow of the fire, they began to tell stories of past voyages, of ancestors who had once stood on their own first shores, of lessons learned from the sea. Some spoke of the signs that had led them to this island, the shift in the swell, the flight paths of the birds, the unusual gathering of clouds. These reflections grounded their experience, weaving the present moment into the broader tapestry of their people's history. Later, as the stars emerged above them, the navigators lay on the sand, tracing the constellations that had guided them across the open ocean. Though the island was new, the sky felt familiar, a dependable companion that remained the same no matter how far they travelled. The constellations formed a bridge between home and this new world, reminding the voyagers that they were part of something larger, a lineage of travelers connected by the same stars. Sleep came gently that first night. Some slept in the canoes, their bodies rocked by the gentle swaying of the tide. Others lay beneath the open sky, feeling the warm sand beneath them and listening to the soft night sounds of the island. The quiet chirping of insects, the distant rustle of leaves, the rhythmic hush of waves on the shore. It was a peaceful sleep, filled with dreams of exploration and gratitude. Morning arrived with soft golden light filtering through palm fronds. The voyagers rose slowly, stretching their limbs and breathing in the crisp air of a new day. A sense of purpose settled over them. Today they would explore deeper inland. They would find places suitable for shelter, fields where crops might grow, and vantage points from which to observe the island's layout. The navigators led the way, moving with a quiet determination. They climbed gentle slopes until they reached higher ground. From there, they could see the full expanse of the island, its rolling hills, dense forests, winding streams, and distant beaches. They noticed where morning mist gathered, where sunlight struck most directly, and where patches of land seemed fertile or sheltered from strong winds. These observations formed the beginnings of a mental map, one that would guide how they used the island's resources and where they might build structures for temporary or longer stay. They marked their ideas not with stones or carvings, but with memory and discussion. Their knowledge was shared openly, reinforcing the sense of unity that defined their journey. Over the next days, the voyagers built small shelters from branches and leaves. They fashioned tools from stone and bone, crafted cooking pits from coral rocks, and began planting seeds brought from home. Each step felt like a quiet promise to the land, a way of saying, "We honor you. We care for you. We come in peace." They also learned from the island itself. They watched how rainwater flowed during sudden showers, how the tides shifted across the lagoon, and how animals moved through the forest. They adapted to the island's rhythms, blending their traditions with the new environment until the two felt seamlessly connected. In time, this island, once unknown, untouched, and distant, became part of their story. They gave it a name, one that reflected its character, its winds, or the birds that circled above its trees. That name carried meaning, marking the island as a member of the greater voyaging world they were slowly creating. Some voyagers would stay, building homes and raising children who would grow up hearing stories of the sea. Others would return to their original islands, sharing news of the new land and inspiring fresh waves of exploration. And still others would continue eastward, guided by signs that their ancestors had once followed: swell patterns, stars, and the subtle language of the horizon. For every landfall, no matter how distant, carried the same truth: discovery was never an end. It was a beginning. And so the voyagers stood on the shore once more, gazing across the calm lagoon toward the open sea. Their feet rested on warm sand, their hearts filled with gratitude, and their minds stirred by the quiet question that always returned, softly persistent, as familiar as the tide. If there is land here, then where is the next island waiting to be found? On every island the voyagers touched, whether small and wind-shaped or lush with deep forests, one truth followed them like a familiar companion. The canoe was not merely a vessel, it was a bridge between worlds. It was a memory of where they had come from and a promise of where they could go next. As the voyaging cultures spread across the Pacific, canoe building grew into an art form that blended engineering with reverence, skill with spirituality, and practicality with quiet beauty. The builders, men and sometimes women whose hands carried generations of knowledge, were regarded with deep respect. Their work shaped the possibilities of the community. A single canoe could transform how far a society could travel, how often they could trade, and how deeply they could remain connected with kin over the horizon. But to create a seaworthy vessel capable of crossing open ocean required more than craftsmanship. It required a way of seeing wood not as a simple resource, but as a living partner. The process always began in the forest. Builders walked through groves of towering trees in early morning light, when the air was cool and the world felt attentive. They listened to the forest's voice, the rustle of leaves, the creak of branches bowing in the wind, and observed which trees stood straight and which leaned, which thrived in rich soil and which endured in thin earth. This careful observation guided their selection, for canoe hulls demanded timber that was strong, enduring, and shaped by growing conditions that mirrored the demands of the sea. Choosing a tree was never rushed. Builders paused before each candidate, touching the bark with thoughtful hands, feeling the subtle rise and fall of the trunk's breath in the wind. They walked around the tree to study its grain, its height, its balance. And when the right one was found, a tree that carried the quiet sturdiness needed for long voyages, they offered gratitude before cutting, thanking the spirit within it for becoming part of a new journey. This moment of acknowledgement created a bond between builder and timber, a relationship that would deepen through every stage of shaping. Once the tree was felled and transported carefully down to the shoreline, the carving began. The builders worked with stone adzes at first, later with tools of shell, bone, or sharpened coral. Their movements were rhythmic and patient. Each strike removed just enough wood to reveal the natural curve of the hull without weakening its structure. The work took weeks, sometimes months, depending on the size and purpose of the canoe. Younger apprentices often gathered nearby, their voices low with concentration as they twisted and prepared the long fibers needed for lashings. These ropes, made from coconut husk or other fibrous plants, were not merely cords. They were lifelines. Every joint of the canoe, from the crossbeams to the outriggers, depended on the strength of these ropes. The apprentices worked the fibers against smooth stones or across their legs until the strands softened, aligned, and twisted into ropes capable of withstanding both storm winds and the constant motion of the ocean. Meanwhile, the master builders continued their shaping. They carved the inside of the hull with exquisite care, thinning the walls evenly so that the canoe would be strong yet flexible. They understood that wood, when shaped correctly, could bend with the swell rather than fight it. This flexibility gave the canoe life, allowing it to glide smoothly even through unpredictable seas. Once the hull was fully carved, it was placed in direct sunlight to dry. The builders monitored this stage closely, for wood that dried too quickly might crack, while wood that dried too slowly might warp. They turned the hull each day to ensure even exposure, brushing it gently with leaves to keep insects away. During this period, the builders often slept near the canoe, tending to it as one might tend to a child. When the hull reached the perfect balance of dryness and strength, the attention turned to the secondary components, the outriggers, crossbeams, and decking. Outriggers were shaped from lightweight wood carved so they would skim across the water without dragging. Crossbeams were fashioned from denser wood, capable of supporting the crew, the sail, and the cargo. Every piece was cut, smoothed, and measured with intuition guiding the hands. The assembly required cooperation. Builders and apprentices worked side by side, lifting the heavy hull, securing the crossbeams, and attaching the outriggers with braided ropes. Each knot mattered. Each lashing had to be tight enough to bind the canoe firmly, yet flexible enough to allow the entire structure to move as one during travel. As the canoe took shape, its form became unmistakably beautiful, a blend of curves and lines that echoed both sea and sky. Its bow rose slightly, ready to meet oncoming waves. Its sides tapered gently, reducing resistance as it moved through the water. Its deck was carved with smooth, welcoming surfaces where voyagers could rest or work. And then came the sail. Woven from pandanus leaves or other strong fibres, the sail was a masterpiece of patience. Women often led this work, weaving strips in long, steady patterns that balanced strength with lightweight flexibility. They understood how wind moved through woven material, how tight or loose patterns affected speed, and how the shape of the sail determined direction. When the sail unfurled for the first time, it often shimmered softly in the sun, catching breezes with quiet grace. Before the canoe could be launched, one final step remained: the dedication. Communities gathered on the beach as the canoe rested on wooden rollers. Children sat near the bow, whispering to one another with excitement. Elders approached the canoe slowly, touching the hull with palms warmed by the sun. They spoke blessings for safe travel, for favourable winds, for strong currents, and for the steady guidance of ancestors whose wisdom lived in every part of the vessel. The launch itself was a moment of stillness and unity. With soft chants rising, the canoe was guided across the sand toward the sea. When the water lifted it for the first time, the hull rocked gently, as if greeting its new home. The voyagers stepped aboard, testing the balance, feeling how the canoe responded to their weight. Some dipped their fingers into the sea, acknowledging the companionship between water and wood. Out on the lagoon, the canoe moved smoothly, cutting through clear water that reflected the sky above. When the sail caught its first breath of wind, the canoe leaned into motion, its hull humming softly with life. The builders watched with quiet pride. Their work, careful, patient, filled with intention, had created a vessel capable of touching horizons far beyond what could be seen. Over time, entire families would travel in these canoes. Children would fall asleep on deck under the glow of constellations. Elders would pass on wisdom as the winds shifted gently across the sail. Communities would reunite after long journeys, bringing stories, songs, and woven gifts from distant islands. Canoe building, then, was not a craft meant for one island alone. It shaped the identity of an entire region, an archipelago of cultures connected through shared knowledge, shared winds, and shared courage. Each new canoe held within it the accumulated understanding of generations and the promise of journeys yet to unfold. And the sea, patient and expansive, waited for these vessels with open arms. For soon, the navigators would teach the next great skill, one that required not only mastery of wood and rope, but mastery of memory, intuition, and the quiet guidance of the world itself. In every voyaging community, long before the great double-hulled canoes set out across the open ocean, a quiet and sacred training began. one that wove together memory, intuition, and the natural world. This training was not formal in the way future civilizations would describe it. There were no written lessons, no carved diagrams, no fixed schedules. Instead, knowledge passed from elder to apprentice like a gentle current flowing through generations. It happened in the spaces between paddling strokes, beside small evening fires, under the cool shadow of palms, and most profoundly, beneath the countless stars of the night sky. Navigators were not chosen by accident. Their path usually began in childhood, often when an elder noticed how a child's attention lingered on subtle things, how they watched the horizon more carefully than others, how they observed the play of light on the water, how their expressions shifted when the wind turned. These small signs marked a temperament suited to listening deeply to the world. Once identified, the child entered a quiet apprenticeship. There were no announcements, no ceremonies. The elder simply invited them to walk along the beach during dawn, or to sit beside them while they worked on repairing the canoe. Through these simple gestures, the first lessons began. Dawn was the navigator's most treasured hour. The horizon softened to pale blues and golds, and the world felt suspended between night and day. The elder and apprentice would walk slowly along the shoreline, listening to the hush of the calm morning swell. At such times, the apprentice was taught to feel the sea with more than their senses. "Close your eyes," the elder would murmur. "Listen for direction." The apprentice stood barefoot, the water brushing their ankles with its cool touch. At first, they could only sense the obvious rhythm of the waves. But with time, subtler patterns emerged, the faint pull of a distant swell, the sideways tug of an unseen current, the low hum of the deeper ocean beneath the surface. "You are learning to hear the world," the elder would say softly. "The sea has many voices. We must listen to them all." Later in the day, lessons continued aboard small canoes. The apprentice sat near the bow, the elder behind them, their presence steady and reassuring. The canoe glided across the lagoon, its hull whispering against the water. Sometimes the elder said nothing at all, letting the apprentice discover sensations on their own. The way the canoe leaned slightly into the wind, the way its movement changed when crossing over underwater ridges, the way birds circled above certain parts of the reef. Other times, the elder shared quiet observations. "Feel how the swell changes. That is not from the wind. That is the memory of land far away." Or, "See the colour of the water there? That tells us it is deep. And there, near the light patch, that is where the sand rises. Learn to read these shifts, and the sea will never confuse you." The apprentice absorbed these lessons slowly. Navigation was not about memorizing facts. It was about building a lifelong relationship with the ocean. And so the teachings drifted into daily life, becoming part of how they walked, listened, breathed, and watched the world. Night brought the most profound lessons. As the sky darkened, the elder and apprentice would lie on woven mats or directly on the soft sand, gazing upward at a vast tapestry of stars. The night sky stretched across them like a wide shimmering dome, and the constellations rose one by one with comforting predictability. "Every star has a journey," the elder whispered, "and every journey has meaning." The apprentice learned to track the rising points of stars along the horizon, to recognize them not as scattered lights, but as markers in a great celestial compass. They studied how clusters of stars moved together, how some appeared only during certain seasons, and how others mark the midpoint of night when long voyages required constant vigilance. The elder often traced invisible lines between stars, drawing shapes in the sky that the apprentice would slowly memorize, shapes that translated into directions, into timing, into knowledge of when to turn the canoe or when to wait for gentler winds. They learned to follow the arc of specific stars across the sky, noting how far they rose before dipping toward the western horizon. Each star's trajectory was a path, and when many paths were known, the sky became a map, vast and reliable. But the apprentice also learned something deeper, something that could not be taught directly. The elder encouraged them to feel the stars rather than merely see them. Let them settle in your mind, they said. Hold them as friends you trust. When clouds hide them, their places will remain with you. This was the heart of wayfinding, the ability to carry the sky within one's memory so that even in darkness or storm, the navigator could guide the canoe with confidence. The apprenticeship required years of watching the world with quiet attention, years of learning the shifting moods of the sea, years of listening to the gentle murmurs of wind. The apprentice learned that navigation was not separate from life. It was woven into every moment. A skilled navigator could sense changes long before they became visible. They knew when a distant storm's swell would arrive, when the wind would shift, when birds would begin to travel toward feeding grounds. They could also sense the presence of land long before any shape appeared on the horizon. A change in the color of the water, the appearance of a certain type of cloud, the smell of soil carried on the wind, each of these signs spoke to them. Yet for all this knowledge, humility remained central. Navigators did not boast of their abilities. They carried deep responsibility, knowing that a crew's safety and often their survival rested upon their guidance. Thus, the apprenticeship also included lessons of character, patience, calmness, and a steady heart. Do not rush the sea, elders would say, and do not rush yourself. When the apprentice grew older and more skilled, they accompanied the navigator on longer journeys. They took turns at night, watching the stars with quiet diligence. They felt the swell with closed eyes, memorizing its patterns. They listened to the reeds of the sail, understanding how its flutter changed with the subtlest shift in wind direction. One night, after many seasons of learning, the elder stood back and allowed the apprentice to guide the canoe through several hours of darkness. The sea was calm, the stars brilliant, and the apprentice felt the weight of responsibility settle into their chest. Their hands rested lightly on the steering paddle. Their eyes traced the constellations with practiced ease. They inhaled the cool night air and felt the swell gently rock the hull. The elder watched silently. By dawn, the canoe had stayed precisely on course. The apprentice did not cheer. They simply breathed, long, slow, accepting. They felt a deep and quiet recognition settle into them, that they were not merely watching the sky, not merely feeling the sea. They were part of it. The ocean's rhythm, the star's arc, the wind's gentle breath, all of it flowed through them as naturally as their own heartbeat. This was the moment an apprentice became a navigator, not with words, but with understanding. In the years that followed, these newly trained navigators guided canoes across vast distances. They led communities to new islands, connected families across archipelagos, and kept traditions alive. They carried the knowledge of countless generations, the quiet voices of those who had once stood beneath the same stars. And with every successful voyage, apprentices grew into elders, elders grew into memories, and memories grew into the timeless practice that shaped an entire civilization. Soon, these navigators, armed with their celestial maps, their attunement to waves, and their deep intuition, would guide their people across distances that no one else in the world had dared to cross. For a new world awaited them, the farthest reaches of the Pacific, where scattered islands formed a vast triangular realm that would one day be called Polynesia. As the navigators grew in mastery, feeling the sea with their whole being, reading the sky with intuitive clarity, and guiding double-hulled canoes across unimaginable distances, the world they inhabited began to expand into something extraordinary. What had once been a scattered collection of islands connected by cautious voyaging slowly became a vast, living network stretching across the largest ocean on Earth. This world, shaped by the path of stars and the whispers of waves, would one day be known as the Polynesian Triangle. But in its early form, it was not a triangle at all. It was a series of discoveries, a chain of landfalls, each one adding a new thread to the tapestry of a people whose identity was woven from movement. The voyagers who first stepped onto those distant shores carried with them seeds, language, stories, and memories of their ancestors. They planted taro in fertile riverbeds, coaxed coconuts to take root along sunlit shores, and introduced the gentle squeals of pigs and the soft clucks of chickens into places where no such sounds had been heard before. These familiar comforts allowed them to transform new lands into true homes, each island becoming a reflection of the world they had come from, yet shaped by the unique nature of its environment. It began in the tropics, among the warm islands of Samoa and Tonga. These archipelagos became centers of gravity in an increasingly sophisticated voyaging world. Here, knowledge flowed as steadily as trade winds. Navigators met to exchange insights about star paths and swells. Canoe builders shared new fastening techniques and hull designs. Families deepened alliances through marriage, weaving the social fabric that would support future voyages. In these islands, communities grew more interconnected, their stories and traditions blending into a culture distinct from their earlier Austronesian ancestors. Their language shifted, becoming the root from which future Polynesian dialects would bloom. Their ceremonies took on new meaning, influenced by life in these central islands where the sea seemed to beckon with promise. But even these rich lands, blessed with abundant forests, rivers, and reefs, were not the end of their journey. The horizon remained a source of quiet invitation. And so, with seasons of preparation and careful observation of winds and stars, the canoes pushed farther east. These voyages were not hurried. They were deliberate, guided by long apprenticeships and collective wisdom. Some journeys took weeks, with the sea stretching endlessly in all directions. Yet the voyagers did not despair. They carried with them the calm certainty that the ocean was full of subtle signs. Subtle, yes, but clear to those who had learned to listen. Eventually, they found islands suspended in the deep Pacific, each one separated from the next by hundreds or thousands of miles. Islands like the Cook Islands, the Society Islands, and the Marquesas rose from the sea as green sanctuaries shaped by volcanic fire and softened by rainfall. These islands offered fertile land, protected lagoons, and mountain valleys where mists clung to the trees in early morning. The voyagers explored them, mapped them in memory, and shared news of each new land with the communities they returned to. Families began settling on these islands, building homes, carving canoes, and raising children who would grow up knowing only the soft cadence of these new shores. Each island group developed its own customs, shaped by the character of its environment, yet bound to the wider voyaging world by shared language, ancestry, and reverence for navigation. From these central Polynesian islands, voyaging intensified. Canoes traced star paths farther still, north to Hawaii, south to Aotearoa, and east to the remote and rugged Rapa Nui. These three farthest points formed the shape that would later define the Polynesian Triangle. But for the people themselves, it was not the shape that mattered. It was the connection. These destinations were astonishingly distant, each requiring exceptional skill to reach. The journey north led to Hawaii, a place of towering mountains, deep valleys, and immense ocean swells that seemed to speak with ancient voices. The voyagers who landed there found fresh water cascading down cliffs, forests thick with new plants, and volcanic landscapes unlike anything they had known. They adapted their tools, their shelters, and their planting strategies to the land. Over generations, Hawaii developed into a thriving cultural center, rich with its own chants, carving traditions, and social structures. Southward lay Aotearoa, one of the most distant and challenging islands ever reached by Polynesian navigators. The climate was cooler, the seasons more pronounced, and the land filled with dense forests, large flightless birds, and striking snow-capped peaks. Here, new materials required new solutions. Canoes grew sturdier, clothing adapted to colder winds. Stories evolved to reflect a landscape where the sea and mountains shaped daily life as profoundly as the sky. Far to the east lay Rapa Nui, a place so isolated that the world around it seemed to fall away into endless horizons. The voyagers who reached this small island brought with them their traditions, their crops, and their deep connection to the ocean. Over generations, they built a unique society that carved massive stone figures, moai, that watched over the land with serene expressions, their backs to the sea as though protecting the world behind them. Across all these distant places, one cultural thread remained unbroken: the navigators. They moved between islands as memory keepers, carrying oral histories that preserved the unity of a world separated by vast distances. The stars they used to guide their canoes rose over every island they visited. The swell patterns they read echoed across thousands of miles. The clouds they studied formed over volcanic peaks in Hawaii, just as they formed over valleys in Aotearoa or cliffs in the Marquesas. These shared signs wove the farthest corners of the Pacific into a single cultural landscape, a world connected not by land, but by ocean. Within this expanding civilization, identity grew both local and global. A child born on any one island might learn chants that reference places thousands of miles away. An elder might speak of ancestral paths that crossed the Pacific in long arcs, connecting their lineage to voyagers from distant shores. Community gatherings often included stories of star paths leading to islands known only through memory or song, a testament to their ancestors' long journeys. As generations passed, the voyaging network matured into something remarkable, a civilization without borders, maintained through movement, memory, and shared purpose. Families were separated by great distances, yet remained united through rituals, language, and the navigational traditions passed down through apprenticeships that continued, unwavering, across centuries. By now, the triangle of islands stretched across an ocean larger than continents, and still, the navigators moved across it with astonishing confidence. This was the world they had created, a world where the stars were maps, the sea was a highway, and every island, no matter how distant, felt connected to every other. A world where identity was fluid, passing easily across horizons as voyagers carried songs, seeds, tools, and stories to distant relatives. Yet for all its beauty, this vast cultural realm would face moments of challenge and transformation. New lands lay ahead, but so did new trials, environmental, social, and eventually, the unforeseen encounters with people beyond the Pacific. Before long, the navigators would guide their people into the southernmost reaches of the Polynesian world, and the land they would find there would challenge everything they knew about weather, seasons, and survival. The canoes that pushed southward from the warm Central Pacific carried with them families, seeds, tools, and ancestral hopes. But they also carried a deep curiosity. For generations, navigators had studied distant signs in the southern sky. Stars that dipped low and reappeared in unfamiliar arcs. Swells that seemed to originate from colder waters, and stories whispered across islands of a far country touched by long shadows and mist. These hints spoke of a land larger than any they had visited before, a land waiting at the edge of the world. No one knew exactly what awaited them there. But the navigators trusted their knowledge, and the voyagers trusted the navigators. When they finally crossed the last stretch of deep ocean and Aotearoa appeared on the horizon, it looked unlike any island they had known. The coastline rose with dramatic cliffs and long stretches of rugged beach, backed by forests so dense they seemed to hold secrets in their shadows. Snow-capped mountains pierced the clouds in the distance, something no Polynesian had ever seen, yet they greeted the sight with awe rather than fear. The land was vast, stretching beyond the curve of the world, its rivers winding like silver threads across rolling plains. Mist curled between the trees in morning and lingered long into the day. The air itself carried a new kind of coolness, fresh and crisp, infused with scents of unfamiliar plants. As the canoes approached shore, the voyagers felt the temperature shift on their skin. Cold breezes flowed from the mountains, brushing against their faces and ruffling the edges of their cloaks. Yet this new climate did not deter them. It simply sharpened their senses and stirred their appreciation for the unknown. Stepping ashore, they felt the earth beneath them, firm, dark, and rich. The forest canopy towered overhead, alive with the calls of birds they had never heard before. Some had deep, resonant voices that echoed through the trees. Others chirped in soft, intricate patterns. The voyagers listened with wonder, their eyes adjusting to the shifting greenery of this new world. Exploration began almost immediately. The navigators and skilled hunters walked inland, following streams that cut through fern-covered paths. They found groves of trees unlike any they had known, massive trunks that rose straight and true, capable of yielding canoes many times larger than the ones they had brought. These trees held the promise of a new era of voyaging, though no one yet realized how profoundly they would shape the people's future. In the valleys, the voyagers discovered rivers filled with clear, cold water and forests teeming with birds. There were no land mammals to fear, no predators stalking the underbrush, only silence and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by wind or wings. The land felt generous, offering safety, food, and raw materials in abundance. Yet Aotearoa also demanded adaptation. The seasons were more pronounced here. Winter brought cold winds, frost, and shorter days. The voyagers quickly realized that the crops they had relied upon in the tropics would need care and adjustments to grow in this climate. They began experimenting with planting schedules, choosing sheltered valleys where the soil warmed quickly, and creating storage pits to protect food through colder months. The people adapted their clothing too. They wove cloaks from the soft fibers of native plants, layering them with feathers to create warmth and beauty. These cloaks, intricately designed and dyed with natural colors, became cherished items that reflected personal and ancestral identity. Shelter required new creativity. Houses were built lower, with thicker walls and deeper foundations to protect against cold winds. Roofs were layered with insulating thatch. Fire pits became central parts of communal life, offering warmth, light, and a place for storytelling through long winter evenings. All the while, navigators studied their new environment with open curiosity. They observed how the stars behaved in southern skies, stars that dipped lower, constellations that appeared in different seasons, and celestial patterns that required careful recalibration. The navigators did not see these changes as obstacles, but as invitations to expand their knowledge. In time, the people began exploring both islands of Aotearoa. They travelled through dense forests, across mountain passes, and along winding coastlines. Canoes moved between harbours and sounds, navigating fjords lined with towering cliffs. Communities formed in pockets of land rich in resources, sheltered bays, fertile river valleys, and coastal plains where fishing was plentiful. As generations passed, these communities developed a distinct identity, deeply tied to the land. They learned the behaviour of local birds, crafted tools from strong native woods and stone, and carved designs that echoed the shapes of the forests, mountains, and waves surrounding them. Their stories transformed too, filling with the voices of this new world, blending their ancestral Polynesian heritage with the spirit of Aotearoa. One of the most profound changes came through the deepening bond with the land itself. The people began to speak of mountains as ancestors, of rivers as guardians, of forests as sources of wisdom. The land's immense presence encouraged reflection, humility, and a reverence that shaped their worldview for centuries. Yet even as they rooted themselves deeply in this southern world, the memories of their ocean passages remained sharp in their minds. Songs honoured the navigators who brought them here. Chants recounted the star paths that guided their canoes, and stories preserved the techniques that allowed them to survive the vast open sea. These oral traditions ensured that navigation never faded from cultural memory, even as fewer long voyages were made across the deep Pacific. Some canoes did return northward, reconnecting with kin in tropical islands and reinforcing cultural bonds. But over time, as populations grew and the demands of the land deepened, the people of Aotearoa increasingly saw their home not as a waypoint, but as a destination, a place where their culture could flourish anew. Still, the echoes of their voyaging origins remained unmistakable. Their art carried motifs reminiscent of ocean waves. Their chants held rhythms that remembered the roll of the sea. Their carved canoes, now shaped from the mighty trees of Aotearoa, carried the same sacred significance as those of their ancestors. And always, the stars remained above them. Even in this southern world, the navigator's celestial compass guided seasonal cycles, storytelling traditions, and a sense of time that stretched far beyond any single lifetime. Aotearoa became the southern anchor of the vast Polynesian world, a place where the ingenuity, resilience, and spiritual depth of the voyagers blossomed in new and remarkable ways. But the story of the Polynesian Navigators continued far beyond this point, for scattered across the Pacific were islands much older, with mysteries carved into stone and legends that whispered of early settlers whose memory had long faded. One such island lay far to the east, isolated and windswept, holding silent guardians of stone who watched the sea with serene and enigmatic faces. Long before the navigators of Polynesia spread across the vast Pacific, long before double-hulled canoes sliced through open seas guided by stars and swells, there existed an even more ancient people whose fingerprints were left not in living memory, but in shards of pottery buried beneath generations of sand. These people, the Lapita, form the deep ancestral foundation of the Pacific voyaging world. Though their names and voices have faded with time, their legacy echoes quietly across islands from Melanesia to Polynesia, like a gentle tide that never fully retreats. In many ways, the Lapita lived in a world both familiar and foreign to later Polynesians. They navigated coastal waters and island channels, built sturdy canoes, and travelled with families, crops, and animals. But the world they encountered was different, wilder, less populated, and filled with challenges that tested early voyagers' ingenuity. Their tools were simpler, and their knowledge was in its early stages. Yet their courage set the foundations for every long-distance journey that came after. On certain remote islands, when the sand is brushed aside, or when storms uncover hidden layers along the shore, the distinctive patterns of Lapita pottery emerge. Complex, geometric designs stamped with intricate motifs. These fragments are often no larger than the palm of a hand, yet they carry the quiet weight of entire migrations. The patterns are made of tiny, repeated impressions, forming spirals, diamonds, triangles, and delicate borders that reveal both artistic sensibility and cultural meaning. Archaeologists can explain how these patterns were created, but what they meant to the Lapita themselves remains a soft mystery. Perhaps they held ceremonial significance. Perhaps they marked family lines or honoured ancestors. Or perhaps they were simply expressions of beauty in a world defined by sea and sky. Whatever their purpose, these designs remain the clearest fingerprints of the ancient voyaging ancestors. Imagine one of these early communities, a small settlement built near a protected lagoon, with houses raised on stilts above the shoreline to keep safe from tides and weather. The sea stretches wide in every direction, dotted with mangroves and coral reefs alive with fish. Smoke rises gently from cooking fires, and voices carry quietly through the warm evening air. Children explore tide pools, their laughter blending with the sound of the surf. Adults gather clay from riverbeds, shaping pots that will store food or cook meals for the journeys ahead. For thousands of years, such communities thrived in the Western Pacific, moving gradually eastward as generations expanded. No single voyage carried the Lapita people to distant lands. Instead, they journeyed step by step, island by island, following the arc of volcanic chains and listening to the guidance of wind, stars, and instinct. Their canoes were simpler than those of later Polynesians, yet they were strong enough to cross significant distances, allowing them to settle new territories overlooked by earlier inhabitants. As the Lapita spread into remote islands, their pottery accompanied them, serving as both practical vessels and cultural markers. But over time, as communities moved ever farther into the open Pacific, pottery slowly disappeared from their daily lives. The clay found in early homelands was not available on many remote islands. New techniques emerged, new materials took precedence, and eventually the art of decorated pottery faded away. Yet the spirit behind that art, the desire to express identity, to preserve memory, to carry the past into the future, remained. In later centuries, Polynesian navigators would carve intricate designs into wood, tattoo them onto skin, and weave them into mats and sails. These patterns, though evolved, echoed the geometric sensibilities of Lapita ancestors. Each line, curve, and spiral felt like a whisper reaching across time. On some islands, elders spoke of spirits who arrived from the west long ago, carrying fire, tools, and knowledge of the sea. These memories, though intangible, formed a cultural thread that tied later Polynesians to their ancient predecessors. Stories told by candlelight or beneath the moon described early ancestors traveling between world after world, searching for places where their families could flourish. The details changed across islands, but the core remained. Movement, exploration, and deep reverence for the ocean. Lapita settlements also left behind another kind of memory, one not made of pottery, but of the landscapes they shaped. Evidence of gardens, fishing traps, and hearth pits reveals how early communities adapted to each island's rhythm. They learned which plants grew well in volcanic soil, which fish gathered near reef crests at certain tides, and how best to store food for changing seasons. They developed strategies for sustainability long before the term existed, ensuring that each island could support their growing families. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Lapita people was not their pottery or tools. It was the mindset that allowed them to travel beyond the horizon. They were among the first to trust the open sea, to see water not as a boundary but as a pathway. Their courage established a foundation of belief that the world was connected, that invisible islands waited beyond the edge of sight, that knowledge could be carried across waves instead of carved on stone. Later, Polynesians inherited this mindset completely. Even as pottery fell away, the voyaging spirit strengthened. Successive generations refined navigation techniques, developed larger and more stable canoes, and learned the secrets of reading stars and swells with unparalleled mastery. But the roots of that mastery lay deep in Lapita soil. Soil carried from one island to another in woven baskets, in cultural memory, and in the stories families told at night. When modern navigators retrace traditional routes, they often speak of feeling a presence guiding them, not supernatural, but ancestral. They describe moments when the movement of the canoe or the arc of the stars feels familiar, as though their bodies recognize patterns older than any living memory. These sensations, many believe, are echoes of Lapita teachings embedded in the very foundation of Pacific voyaging. The pottery shards found beneath layers of sand are small, fragile, and easily overlooked by the untrained eye. Yet to archaeologists and cultural historians, they hold the same significance as the great stone statues of Rapa Nui or the massive canoes of Micronesian master navigators. They are keys to understanding the ancient flow of human movement across the ocean, keys to understanding how one of the greatest maritime cultures in history came to be. On quiet evenings, when the waves lap against the shore and the stars emerge one by one, some Pacific islanders still touch pieces of Lapita pottery with reverence. The cool clay feels smooth beneath their fingertips, marked with patterns that have survived centuries of wind, rain, and shifting sands. They hold those fragments the way one might hold a treasured heirloom, sensing the presence of ancestors who journeyed far, endured much, and dreamed boldly. For in those quiet patterns stamped into clay lies the earliest heartbeat of the Polynesian world, a heartbeat that would echo through generations of navigators, explorers, storytellers, and families who would one day settle islands stretching across a third of the planet's surface. And as those ancient echoes carried forward, another chapter awaited, a chapter that would challenge the voyagers in ways they could never have foreseen. New arrivals would one day reach the Pacific from distant continents, altering the currents of life, knowledge, and tradition. For countless generations, the Polynesian world had evolved in harmony with its islands, winds, and stars. Communities thrived across vast distances, connected by ancestral knowledge, shared language roots, and the steady pulse of the ocean. But even the most enduring rhythms eventually encounter new currents, and the Pacific, so wide, so seemingly tranquil, was not exempt from the larger movements of global history. Long after the Lapita people left their clay patterns in the sand, and long after the great navigators shaped their world through memory and starlight, new canoes appeared on the horizon, canoes unlike any the Polynesians had ever seen. These vessels were made of unfamiliar wood, shaped in ways that seemed both massive and rigid. Their sails were not woven from pandanus leaves, but crafted from heavy cloth that billowed in strange, towering shapes. And upon these vessels came people who spoke unknown languages, carried metal tools, and observed the islands with cautious curiosity. These were the first outsiders to reach Polynesian shores, sailors from distant continents navigating with compasses and charts rather than stars and swells. Their arrival did not come all at once. Instead, it appeared gradually, like the slow approach of a distant swell. Some islands saw these ships long before others. Some encountered traders with hopeful intentions. Others faced explorers driven by ambition or misunderstanding. Yet across the Pacific, the pattern was unmistakable. The Polynesian world, long shaped by harmonious internal rhythms, was beginning to encounter external forces that would shift its course. For the people of the islands, the first moments of contact were filled with wonder and caution. Islanders gathered at the shore, watching these foreign ships anchor offshore. They marveled at the towering masts, the unfamiliar shapes of the hulls, and the people aboard whose clothing rustled in the wind and whose voices carried accents completely unlike their own. The islanders approached with gifts, woven mats, fresh fruits, carved adornments, gestures of peace woven deeply into their traditions. And often, at least at first, visitors responded with curiosity of their own. Sailors, exhausted from months at sea, welcomed the sight of land and the generosity of islanders who offered fresh water, food, and shelter. They marveled at the navigational skill of people who had crossed the same ocean without compasses or metal instruments. Some recorded their astonishment in diaries, noting how the islanders' canoes moved swiftly through the surf and how their knowledge of the stars surpassed that of many seasoned mariners. But contact, even when peaceful, carried challenges far deeper than curiosity could reveal. The newcomers brought objects the islanders had never seen: iron nails, metal tools, glass beads, fabrics dyed in unfamiliar colors. These items fascinated many, yet their presence also shifted relationships within communities. Metal tools made carving easier, knives replaced stone, and new materials slowly integrated into daily life. With these changes came new dynamics, advantages for some, challenges for others, and an evolving sense of what was necessary or desirable. Unintentionally, the visitors also brought illnesses to which the islanders had no immunity. A simple sickness that caused little harm to the sailors sometimes spread rapidly through communities that had lived in isolation for centuries. These illnesses weakened families, altered social rhythms, and left imprints on collective memory that lingered long after the first ships departed. Despite these difficulties, the Polynesian cultural strength remained resilient. Elders continued to pass down stories, chants, and navigational wisdom. Canoe builders maintained their arts, even as metal tools made their work faster. Navigators still observed the stars each night, ensuring that knowledge remained intact. Communities adapted thoughtfully, taking in what was useful while striving to preserve the core of their ancestral traditions. Yet shifts continued. As more ships passed through the Pacific, some carrying traders, others carrying missionaries or explorers, new ideas were introduced. Some brought teachings about distant lands, new spiritual beliefs, and written languages. Islanders responded in diverse ways. Some embraced aspects of these teachings, weaving them into their own traditions. Others resisted, holding firmly to the stories handed down through their ancestors. Every island faced its own unique path. Some saw peaceful integration. Others experienced tensions as misunderstandings arose between cultures with differing worldviews. Still others found themselves caught between competing outsiders seeking influence or resources. The Pacific remained stunningly beautiful, but its social landscape now carried the subtle marks of shifting tides, gentle in some places, more turbulent in others. Throughout all of this, the navigators continued to hold an important place in community life. Even as foreign ships arrived with their compasses and charts, Polynesian wayfinders remained respected for their unparalleled understanding of the sea. Their knowledge, shaped through centuries of observation, remained irreplaceable. Visitors often marveled at how Polynesian navigators could predict weather shifts, identify land without sight, and travel swiftly between islands using nothing more than the natural world as their guide. Still, the balance of power changed as contact increased. The introduction of foreign governance in later periods affected land ownership, resource control, and the structure of society. In some places, traditions were suppressed or discouraged. In others, they persisted quietly, kept alive through whispered stories, songs, and practices carried out in the privacy of family gatherings. But even in the face of these changes, Polynesian identity endured, strong, flexible, and deeply rooted in memory. The voyaging spirit, though challenged, never disappeared. It remained in chants recited at dawn, in carved patterns etched into wood, in the rhythm of paddles dipping into calm lagoon waters. It lived in the reverence for stars, the deep understanding of wind and wave, and the stories passed from one generation to the next. By the time the Pacific entered the modern era, the world had changed dramatically. Yet the core of Polynesian tradition, its connection to ocean, sky, land, and ancestry, remained unbroken. Even when voyaging waned for a time, the knowledge did not vanish. It lingered quietly in the hearts of elders who remembered, waiting for a moment when the world would once again listen. And that moment would come. Soon, new generations would rise with a renewed desire to reclaim the ancient ways. Canoe building would be revived. Star navigation would be taught again, and the vast Pacific, so long crossed by metal ships, would once more feel the presence of canoes guided only by wind, swell, and the timeless wisdom of the ancestors. Before that revival could begin, however, the Polynesian world would continue to face the influences of contact, negotiating new identities, adapting to new realities, and holding close the memories of the ancient voyaging age. For a time, the vast Pacific lay quieter than it once had. The great double-hulled canoes of earlier centuries stood on beaches or in memory, their once bright sails replaced by the silhouettes of foreign ships that now crossed the ocean's surface. Many elders kept the ancient knowledge in their hearts, whispering stories of star paths and wave patterns to their children, even as fewer long voyages were made. Knowledge that had once guided nations across thousands of miles became fragile, precious but fading at the edges. Yet traditions such as these live not only in practice, but in longing. And as generations passed, a quiet yearning began to return, a longing to reconnect with the ancient roots that had carried their ancestors across the world's greatest ocean. Even as modern life reshaped islands and introduced new ways of thinking, something deep within Polynesian communities stirred like a gentle tide pulling back toward its source. The first signs of revival came softly. A young person might ask an elder how a star compass was once memorized. A fisherman might recall his grandfather's stories about swells that could guide a canoe home. A community might begin to celebrate old festivals with renewed energy. These moments were small, but woven together they formed a current strong enough to awaken the voyaging spirit. Stories travelled between islands more frequently, stories of people determined to reclaim the knowledge of their ancestors. In one place, canoe builders began carving again, using old techniques taught by the few elders who still remembered. In another, navigators gathered at night to study the sky, tracing constellations their great-grandparents had once followed. These efforts often took place quietly at first, guided by passion rather than recognition. But gradually, momentum grew. Communities started to speak openly about their heritage. Schools invited cultural practitioners to teach young people. Festivals celebrated ancestral skills. Songs once sung in whispers returned to community gatherings. The ocean, always patient, seemed to listen with approval as familiar rhythms reawakened along its shores. The revival gained breathtaking strength in the late 20th century, when a group of navigators, historians, canoe builders, and cultural leaders came together to attempt something that had not been done in generations: to build a great double-hulled canoe and sail it across the Pacific using only traditional wayfinding. No compass, no sextant, no modern instruments. They wanted not only to prove that ancient Polynesian navigators had been capable of long-distance ocean voyages, but also to reclaim a tradition nearly lost. When the canoe was completed, its beauty stirred hearts across the region. The carved hulls gleamed in the sunlight. The lashings were tight and clean. The sails, woven with care, caught the breeze with the same confident grace that had carried ancestors across thousands of miles. The canoe seemed to hum with memory, as if the wood itself recognized the wind. As the canoe's crew prepared to depart, the community gathered on the beach, much as their ancestors had done centuries earlier. People sang chants of protection, offering blessings for safe travel. Elders whispered guidance, their words drifting across the air like the final notes of a long-held melody. Children watched with wide eyes, sensing they were witnessing something sacred, a moment when the past and future touched hands. When the canoe finally pushed away from shore, a collective breath seemed to rise from the island. It glided across the water with steady purpose, guided by a navigator trained in the traditional ways. He watched the sky, felt the swell beneath the hull, and listened to the wind with an attuned heart. Day after day, night after night, he guided the vessel exactly as his ancestors had done, by sensation, memory, and the quiet wisdom of the natural world. The voyage took weeks. Some days brought calm seas that shimmered like polished glass. Other days brought strong winds that filled the sails with a deep, whispering power. Nights were spent beneath the stars, with the navigator lying close to the deck, feeling the ocean's pulse through the wood. The crew worked together, paddling when needed, tending the sail, sharing food, stories, and songs. They moved as one, united by purpose and trust. When they reached their destination, a distant island many hundreds of miles away, the world took notice. The success of the voyage awakened not only curiosity, but pride across the Pacific. It proved what navigators had always known, that their ancestors had crossed the Pacific through skill, not chance, through knowledge, not myth, and it demonstrated that this knowledge, though once nearly lost, could live again. In the years that followed, the revival blossomed. More canoes were built, each one reflecting the traditions of its place, each one carrying the dreams of generations. Navigators trained apprentices, passing on the star compass and the art of reading waves. Communities held ceremonies celebrating the return of the voyaging tradition. Children learned chants that honored navigators of old. Islands that had once been connected only through memory began reconnecting physically as canoes traveled between them once more. The ocean too responded. When the great canoes returned to the open sea, it was as though the waves themselves recognized the familiar shape of vessels that had once crossed them frequently. The swells embraced the hulls, guiding them gently through calm and storm alike. The winds filled the sails with an eager energy, carrying the canoes across distances their ancestors had once traveled with confidence. On nights at sea, when the sky spread wide and brilliant, navigators lay back on the deck and felt the deep connection to earlier generations. The same stars that guided their ancestors still shone overhead. The same swells that had shaped the earliest voyages still rolled beneath the hulls. The revival was not simply a return to old ways. It was a reconnection with a living, breathing lineage that had never truly vanished. For many islanders, seeing these canoes on the horizon ignited a sense of pride that had slept quietly for generations. They remembered who they were and where they came from. They felt the strength of their ancestors in the rhythmic approach of the waves. They felt the unity of the Pacific world in each cross-island journey. The revival was not just about canoes. It was about identity, about honouring the beauty, resilience, and ingenuity of a people who had shaped one of the world's greatest maritime cultures. It was about proving that traditions carried in memory could be reborn with astonishing vitality, and that ancient knowledge, though quiet, remained alive within the hearts of those who chose to listen. As the revival continued, The Pacific once again heard the familiar sound of paddles dipping into water, of wind catching sails, and of voyagers singing softly through the night. The ocean heard these sounds and welcomed them home. And now, as the voyaging tradition stands strong once more, another question gently arises. The same question that once stirred the hearts of the first navigators. What horizons remain unexplored? And what stories will the next generation carry forward across the sea? Soon, the story of the Polynesian navigators will reach its final chapter. A gentle closing that honours their enduring legacy and the wisdom they continue to share with the world. Long after the first voyagers pushed their canoes into the unknown, long after islands across the Pacific grew into rich and vibrant communities, and long after new peoples arrived with unfamiliar ships and customs, one truth remained steady through every era. The ocean remembers. It remembers the soft rise of sails in moonlight. It remembers the rhythmic dipping of paddles. It remembers the songs carried across waves in the quiet hours before dawn. And it remembers the navigators, those who trusted the sea not as an obstacle, but as a companion. The revival of traditional voyaging had rekindled a flame that had never truly gone out. Across the modern Pacific, the great canoes began sailing once more between islands, each journey renewing bonds that stretched back centuries. Children watched them arrive on the horizon, their hearts swelling with pride, knowing these vessels were more than wood and sail. They were living threads connecting past and future. And so the Polynesian world entered a new chapter, one shaped by reconnection. On many islands, evenings were filled with the quiet sound of storytellers sharing ancestral knowledge. Young navigators gathered around elders, learning to read the sky with the same reverence their ancestors once held. They practiced feeling the swell in the darkness, trusting their bodies to sense subtle changes even when their eyes could see nothing. They listened to the wind as if it were a familiar voice. "Navigation begins here," an elder would say, tapping gently on the apprentice's chest, "before it becomes this," touching their temple. "And only then does it become this." Their hand drifted outward toward the wide ocean. These teachings planted seeds of confidence deep within the new generation. Confidence not rooted in conquest or ambition, but in empathy, humility, and respect for the world around them. Communities rebuilt canoe houses, carving new vessels that echoed ancient designs, while benefiting from modern knowledge of safety and materials. Yet the heart of canoe building remained unchanged. It was still a communal act, a weaving of hands and hopes. When a new canoe took shape, people of all ages contributed, carrying timber, preparing lashings, weaving sails, and singing chants that filled the open air with warmth. When the canoe was launched, entire villages gathered along the shore. Drums pulsed softly. Flowers floated on the water. The vessel glided outward as though guided by unseen ancestors, its hull cutting a quiet path across the lagoon. And when it returned from its first voyage between islands, guided solely by traditional wayfinding, the welcoming celebrations lasted long into the night. Firelight glowed on smiling faces. Children danced barefoot in the sand. Elders wept softly, remembering the strength of those who came before. Across the Pacific, the revival inspired a movement not just of voyaging, but of cultural remembrance. Languages were revitalized, ceremonial dances resurfaced. Ancient chants, once whispered only in private, returned to public gatherings with pride. Entire educational programs emerged, teaching students the celestial compass, the names of stars, and the art of reading clouds and currents. And in this modern Renaissance, the essence of the Polynesian navigators shone brighter than ever. They were not explorers seeking dominion. They were caretakers seeking harmony. Their journeys were acts of trust. Trust in their training, trust in their canoes, trust in the natural world. They believed the ocean would guide those who approached it with humility, patience, and care. And that belief proved true across thousands of years, across distances unmatched by any other ancient maritime culture. In quiet moments, navigators reflected on the legacy they carried. Lying on the deck of a gently rocking canoe, they gazed upward at the night sky, the same sky followed by their ancestors. The stars shone with timeless constancy, forming the same patterns that had guided voyages long before written history. They imagined the first navigators standing on distant shores, looking up with the same mix of curiosity and wonder. They imagined the Lapita ancestors shaping their pottery, unaware that their descendants would one day cross an ocean that spanned a third of the earth. They imagined the first landfalls on remote islands, the joy of discovery, the gratitude whispered into evening winds. And always, they felt part of something larger than themselves. For the legacy of Polynesian navigation was not simply a record of journeys. It was a living testament to the human capacity for listening, learning, and harmonizing with nature. The navigator's wisdom was not about mastery over the sea, but partnership with it. Not about bending nature to human will, but moving in rhythm with forces far older and wiser than humankind. In this way, their legacy held deep lessons for the modern world, lessons about sustainability, respect, and the importance of honoring ancestral knowledge. Many who studied navigation today found themselves learning far more than technique. They learned patience. They learned trust. They learned how to quiet the mind and open the senses. They learned how to listen not only to waves and wind, but to elders and to the teachings passed down through generations. As the revival continued, canoes once again travelled vast distances. Some completed historic routes across the Pacific, connecting Hawaii to Aotearoa, Tahiti to Samoa, the Cook Islands to Rapa Nui. Each journey reaffirmed what had always been true. The Pacific was not a barrier, but a bridge, a highway of wind and water, binding communities across thousands of miles. And through these journeys, new stories emerged, stories of modern navigators braving storms with ancestral calm, stories of young apprentices finding their calling in starlit nights, stories of island communities welcoming voyaging canoes with tears of joy and the rhythmic beat of traditional drums. Even those outside the Pacific found inspiration in the revival. People from around the world watched in awe as navigators guided canoes across open ocean without instruments, proving that the ancient knowledge was not only real, but powerful. Many felt a renewed sense of connection to their own histories, reminded that every culture carries wisdom worth protecting. Yet for the Polynesian navigators themselves, the revival was not about proving anything to the world. It was about remembering who they were. And as the canoes continued to sail, a quiet peace settled across the Pacific. It was the peace that comes from knowing that the past lives on, that traditions endure, and that the ocean's voice continues to be heard by those who listen. In the gentle breeze, in the steady pulse of waves, in the glow of constellations rising from the water's edge, the legacy of the Polynesian navigators remains alive, present in every island, every canoe, every storyteller, every apprentice memorizing the night sky, and for anyone who stands on a quiet beach at dusk, watching stars appear one by one, there is always a moment, soft and unmistakable, when the horizon seems to open just a little wider. A moment that whispers, the journey continues, the ocean remembers, and the stars are still guiding us home.